So we're going to continue to talk about this Sutton Hoo ship burial purse cover from Suffolk, England, 625. We're going to talk about the decoration on it. It basically has 4 groups of figures in the lower row here that are mostly symmetrical. It creates, if we cut this in half, it's a symmetrical design. But the lower row basically consists of men here, and they are standing in between these 2 animal figures, which is kind of a heraldic composition, which we haven't seen for a little bit. And then the 2 center groups represent eagles attacking ducks. And the convex beaks of the eagles fit really tightly against the concave beaks of the ducks here. And they fit together so tightly it's hard to recognize them, and at first you might mistake them for just a pattern or a design. And then above these figures are these geometric, almost like diamond shapes or ruby shapes, with just purely lines and abstract pattern. And then the central design is really this interlacing pattern in which the interlacements actually evolve into abstracted, writhing animal figures. Not quite sure which animals these are supposed to represent. They're so abstracted that it's hard to tell, but kind of interesting. And you can actually see some knots, like Celtic type knots in here too, which is kind of neat. So this ornamentation is actually quite similar to the Islamic ornamentation that we took a look at in the last chapter, due to its use of pattern, but the difference is clear in some ways from Islamic art. Early medieval art is typically made of interlacing patterns and lines mixed with abstracted animal forms. So just try to remember that about medieval art. It's one of the main characteristics of the art being produced during the early Middle Ages in northwestern Europe, is that we have these interlacing patterns and lines that are mixed in with these abstracted animal forms. And this is present in manuscripts that are being made in this time period in this area, metalwork, architecture, which would be, stone and wood. So it's present in a variety of different mediums. And the Vikings also were fond of this. And we will talk about the Vikings after we talk about this a little bit more about the Sutton Hoo ship burial. This belt buckle was found at the Sutton Hoo ship burial. You can see a lot of those interlacing lines and kind of the pattern that's created here. And this was found along with 10 silver bowls, a silver plate, an imperial stamp of the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I, 40 gold coins, probably to pay the 40 oarsmen who would row the deceased across the sea on the final voyage, which was, their belief at the time. And that's probably why they did the ship burial, right? Because it had to be rowed by 40 oarsmen. And then 2 silver spoons were actually found with inscriptions Salos and Palos, which were the St. Paul's names in Greek before and after his baptism. So these spoons are clues that maybe Christianity was happening in this area, and maybe there was a conversion to Christianity that might have taken place with this burial, with the people that were buried in this burial, or the person that was buried in this burial. Some historians think the ship burial was for the East Anglian king Raywald, who was baptized a Christian before his death in 625. But no one really knows who this burial was actually for. There's no evidence that names the man. So in 793, the Vikings, who were named after the Viks, which are coves or harbors in the Norwegian shoreline, they actually landed in the British Isles, the Vikings did. And they destroyed the Christian monasteries in Lindisfarne Island off the Northumbrian, which is the northeastern coast of England. And shortly after, these Northmen, they called them Norsemen, attacked the monasteries at Jarrow in England and Iona Island off the west coast of Scotland. And so they were attacking a lot of the monasteries in Scotland and in England and the British Isles. And they did this because the monasteries were very attractive. They had a lot of treasures, a lot of gold, a lot of jewels, but they were completely undefended because the monks were obviously, they didn't have any weapons or anything like that. So So from then, basically the 793 up until the mid 11th century, the Vikings were really the terror of Western Europe. They had these great ships. They would get on these ships seasonally, and they would just plunder harbors and river settlements. They had fast, seaworthy longboats that took them on wide-ranging voyages, so they had very capable longboats. And they traveled to Ireland, Russia, to Iceland, Greenland, and they even went as far as Newfoundland in North America, but they were there briefly, and that was long before Columbus arrived in the New World. So the Vikings went very far with their ships. They had really, capable ships. And the Vikings not only conquered the land, but they also colonized the lands that they conquered. And they were able to acquire and govern large territories in Ireland, England, and France, and as well as the Baltic regions and Russia. So they were able to kind of establish a fairly large empire. They settled in northern France in the early 10th century, and their territory actually became known as Normandy, home of the Norsemen, who became Normans. So they had kind of a lot of different names. Later, a Norman duke, William the Conqueror, sailed across the English Channel and invaded and became the master of Anglo-Saxon England. So the Vikings have a lot of different names and a lot of different, a lot of lineage, basically. So we'll talk about the Augsburg ship burial. And this is basically, most of the preserved art of the Vikings comes in the form of their intricately carved wooden ships. So mostly what we have left behind from the Vikings are actually their ships that they left behind. And so this is a ship from a Viking ship burial from Augsburg, Norway. 820, it's wood. It's about 70 feet long, so it's quite long. Probably why it's called a longboat. And you can see some striking examples of Viking wood carving on this wooden ship. And this was discovered under an earthen mound. So this would have been buried under in the dirt, and then a mound piled on top of that. And they were not the only civilization to bury their dead in sailing vessels. So this isn't unique to the Vikings. Sometimes they were buried and covered with great earthen mounds, and sometimes they were actually set adrift in the ocean. So it was done several ways, but this one was actually buried, and that's why we still have it. And this was discovered in 1904, and it was basically on the west coast of the Oslo Fjord in Norway. And unfortunately, grave robbers had already plundered the treasure of the jewelry and the metalwork that was probably buried with the deceased. But other furnishings are intact, such as the ship itself, which is pretty impressive. And you can see the intricate carving and this little spiral here at the top of the prow here. So we'll talk about this animal head post. It's from the same burial, the Augsburg ship burial. And they actually found 5 animal head posts, and their function is uncertain. They were found in the ship's burial chamber, which I believe is just inside of the mound where the ship was. And scholars did analysis of the wood and found that these posts date from 834. 2 women were actually found in the burial chamber, and they were of different ages. So one was around 70 and one was around 50. And they think that the older one was an important figure, and the second younger woman of 50 years old was probably her attendant, who followed her mistress into the afterlife. She probably, committed suicide or something. Voluntarily, probably. It was probably her duty to do that. Maybe she was happy to follow her mistress. They also found skeletons of 14 horses, 3 dogs, and an ox. So they found quite a few animals as well, some skeletons. And the ship is thought to be about 15 years older than the burial was. And it was a seaworthy vessel. This ship was actually capable of making voyages, but it is really of a light construction, so it was probably more of a coastal voyage boat, not something that they would take on like the open ocean. It does have 15 pairs of holes 4 oars that really indicate that 30 rowers were able to row the ship. And the mast was around 28 feet tall. And it may have been a pleasure yacht, belonging to the woman of high status. And it was an elegant, it was elongated shape. It has a lot of sweeping lines. And actually this ends in a stylized sea serpent's head. We can't see it very well, but I guess that this ends in a sea serpent head. All along the border of the ship are carved reliefs of interlaced animals, and that's pretty much the most characteristic design in the Viking artistic tradition, basically, are interlacing animal designs and lines, things like that. So we'll talk about the Staver Church at Urns. By the 11th century, most of Scandinavia had actually been converted to Christianity, but the Viking artistic tradition still survived in these areas. So here's a wood portal of the Staver Church at Urns, Norway, 1050 to 1070. So the decoration of the wood portal of the Staver Church at Urns, Norway, is a notable example of that persistence of the Viking artistic traditions. You can see that in the interlacing animal figures here. And we'll talk about what staves are. Staves are wedge-shaped timbers placed vertically. And this portal and a few staves are all that remain from the original structure, which was a mid-century church, a mid-11th century church. And later builders actually kept them, and they just incorporated them into remaining, these fragments into the new church that was built here, the 12th century church that actually survives today. So the 12th century church, they actually preserved parts of the 11th century church. So parts of the church are actually older, and this is the 11th century part of the church that survives. And the wood portal features these elongated animal forms that intertwine with plant stalks and tendrils in kind of a spiraling rhythm. And it has this effect of natural growth. And the organic forms are highly abstracted. So there's one large four-legged animal at the left of the portal, perhaps serving as a guardian, much like the lamassu in Mesopotamia, potentially. It bites and is bitten by one of the serpentine animals that is kind of writhing. And it exemplifies the intertwining compositions favored by the non-Romans north of the Alps before their conversion to Christianity. And obviously this was after their conversion of Christianity, but we still have the influences of the Viking tradition here, artistic tradition, which is that, kind of intertwining animal forms.